Thanks so much to all three of our speakers. I learned a great deal from all three papers. What I'd like to do is ask each of you to choose among three questions that I have so that nobody will be blindsided. I hope at least one of the three that I ask each of you will be to your liking. And if you could speak for a minute or two and then leave some time for questions from the audience. So Stephanie, first, I wonder if you choose this of the options, I wonder if you could talk about the place of critical theory within your own overall view. So some people want to say that critical theory is the only rigorous method, okay? And I take it you do not agree with that, nor would Whitehead. So in Whitehead's Aims of Education, just to cite one example, he talks about learning in terms of three stages: romance, where you get interested in an idea and are excited about something; secondly, precision or critique, where you develop the critical skills necessary to deal with the subject matter in question; and then thirdly, generalization, where you take the results of romance and precision and place them within a larger whole, which for Whitehead involved metaphysics and cosmology. I don't know if you want to go that route, but I would like to ask about the wider frame that you have in mind, which enables you to say something negative about critical theory. The second option, I take it that the problem that you see with critical theory is that it leaves the bifurcation of nature intact. And that's a problem both, I'm alleging this is your view, so correct me if I'm misinterpreting you. And that's a problem both because it underplays subhuman agency and then overplays human agency. So I'd like to ask about how you would articulate this notion that critical theory underplays subhuman agency. Now, process thinkers have doctrines like panpsychism or panexperientialism that they would use to articulate that, or maybe biosemiotic theory, or maybe a theory of animal rights. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more, if this is the option you choose, about this underplaying of subhuman agency. And I'd also like to ask about whether or not you would agree that there's an underplaying of subhuman patiency status. So process thinkers like Whitehead and Hartshorne like to go back to Plato's notion and the sophist that any being, anything that exists because it has the power to affect others and to be affected by others. And if you think of the topic of animal rights, moral patiency status looms larger there than the issue of moral agency status. Okay. And then the third issue concerns the section in your paper which you did not have a chance to read, which I really liked, where you talk about Carolyn Merchant and the death of nature. So, and this is a big theme in Whitehead too, right? That mechanism was a disaster, and Whitehead urges us to, switch to an organic view of nature. And this seems to be related to a switch in a conception of power. So as a political scientist, you might be willing to talk about power, okay? Specifically, Whitehead's distinction between coercive power on the one hand and then persuasive power on the other. So I wonder if you could pick one of those three and talk for a minute or two.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments and questions, and for the generous gesture to give us a choice of question. Unfortunately, I want to answer all of your excellent questions. But if I'm going to speak for just a minute or two, maybe the best place to go is to talk about, is to respond to your first question, which is what is the place of critical theory within my own overall approach? And as I tried to sort of set out at the outset, I think that critical theory is we can't do without it, right? It sort of enables us to conduct certain kinds of investigations, but I think, as a political theorist, critical theory also generates certain kinds of political affects that really are energizing and they're mobilizing, and I think we can't, right? We can't let those go. So it's a powerful source of energetic affect, which you need to get certain kinds of movements and transformations underway and to keep them going, right? So from an affective perspective, I think if for no other reason, we can't do without critical theory. But some of the language I used in my presentation I took or borrowed from Rita Felsky, whose book The Limits of Critique describes something she calls critical exceptionalism, which is her term to name a sort of a trend of treating critique, and she's a literary theorist, but the same can be said for political theory, which is critique becomes the only way to do scholarship rightly and righteously. And so she goes and looks at certain limits to this way of thinking about critique, and I'm interested by Felsky's approach. She talks about the importance of affect and attachment, and positive affect and attachment, and not just this sort of affect of distance and skepticism and suspicion. And I like what she's doing, but I think that we can pay even closer attention to another type of affect, which is more material, and that's when we look at the ways that our bodies and our thinking are interrupted, inflected, shaped by these non-human forces, right? So in climatic forces. And that way of thinking, you really can't get with critique because, and I'm trying in earnest to find critical theoretical traditions to engage with and sort of in a constructive way. But it does seem to be quite difficult to bring in affirmative attention to the capacity of affect to bring about positive transformation, and I mean affect in that material sense. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So Yuki, the first option I'd like to give you is to talk a little bit about the relationship between your view of shame and the concept of original sin. I'm not a theologian or a religious studies person, but I couldn't help but think of original sin because there are certain things that I have done, certain sins I may have committed for which I would feel guilty. For example, if I lied, cheated, or engaged in electoral fraud, okay? Some people might accuse me of doing that. Guilt seems appropriate there, right? But you want to distinguish shame from guilt. And that struck me as analogous to the difference between the normal old sins like lying and cheating and electoral fraud on the one hand, and then original sin, which is not due to anything that, it wasn't any misdeed on my part that would, prop up the concept of original sin. And no doubt the notion of original sin has been overemphasized in certain aspects of the Christian tradition, right? But anyhow, I was just wondering what the relationship is between sin and original sin and shame. Secondly, another option would be to have you talk about your post-liberal, I don't think you use that phrase, but post-Western democracy view. I can see why some people would have criticisms of political liberalism, say, due to what Rawls calls the curse of money on politics. There are sort of familiar problems there. But I noticed that you do use the word rights in your talk, and I was thinking of some possible positive things associated with political liberalism that might endure in some sort of post-Western democracy view, and I'd like to ask about that, like concept of rights, freedom of speech, separation of powers, and so on. Whitehead and Hartshorne themselves were political liberals, but clearly not laissez-faire neoliberals. So I know in everyday discourse, some people sort of push those two together, but they're quite different. So if you might want to talk a little bit about what your post-Western democracy view would do to some of the best features of political liberalism. And then thirdly, you might want to talk or help me understand how shame could play a role in creative transformation. Whenever I have experienced what you call shame, I tend to be paralyzed by it. And it's not a dynamic thing that leads to creative transformation, but you have a sense that it does. Now, this distinction that you make between chronos and kairos, I found very helpful. But if you could help me understand a little bit better the link you want to draw between shame on the one hand and then creative transformation on the other. So I wonder if you could pick one of those three and go with it.
I'm trying to pick the easy one.
Okay.
And I don't know that that's possible. So I'm gonna answer that last one, and I may get into the others as well, because I find them to be very related. So I will begin with a sense of shame of my own about my use of creative transformation, in that this is, and I stated before, this is beginning work for me. Mm-hmm. and I turned to it, and it was, for me, it felt like a very happy, think effectively, happenstance, because I was drawn to Giorgio Agamben's understanding of shame because it was so different from what I've received from the common understanding that it proliferates in Western society, which is shame is an affect of it's violent, it's toxic, it is not associated with the best of humanity. And yet it's not assumed that by every culture in the world. And so my investigation has really been looking at how have we received this understanding about shame, and in what ways was that formed? And through the investigations that I've done, I look at the ways in which original Western writings around shame took place in relationship with colonialisms and legitimating colonialisms and the violence of colonialisms, of Western colonialism. And so it made me wonder if shame is really is an affect that we feel, is it necessarily always bad? Is it necessarily always paralyzing or frightening, or is there a utility or something that is meant to be learned in that moment of passivity and that shock? And there's a wonderful, I think it's a wonderful book anyway. There's a shame theorist or a sociologist named Helen Merrill Lind who wrote a book in the 50s called On Shame and the Search for Identity. And she takes this very different tack from books that were written at the time about shame, where she talks about the ways in which shame is related to an exposure of the self, but also the world, where we uncover understandings about ourselves that we didn't know, and very similar to what Agamben is saying about the self being confronted with the self, and that causes this stopping. And I think it's very important to distinguish between the violence of shame as it has been taken up by governmental or social powers in order to silence or destroy. I mean, if you look at who receives the brunt of shame, they are usually the ones who are deemed most inhuman or most killable, I mean, to use Agamben's framework. And so for me, as somebody who is not part of that group, the question for me is, in being exposed to this, in this relationship of violence that I'm protected from somehow, or that I could be a part of except for different happenstances or strategies of social or political belonging, I feel shame at knowing this, but is there something in that calls me into some responsibility or some accountability and helps me understand that the world that I have received is not the world that must be? Mm-hmm. And so shame becomes this reorientation of ontology, of political structure, of the cosmos for me, mm-hmm. Getting back to original sin, mm-hmm. Poor Augustine. What I found in creative transformation, creative transformation does not feel good. Mm-hmm. It is not necessarily a great thing, but it is that recognition that the world is dynamic and changing, mm-hmm. and that we have accountabilities and responsibilities and solidarities in the changing and the dynamic processes. Mm-hmm. And so the problem with this approach is how I don't have any pragmatic answers. But then again, I think that what I've learned from this investigation is it's so common, especially in it's so common in the systems, the structures that we've inherited to think I must do something, mm-hmm. when maybe it's not that I must do something, but we must do something. Mm-hmm. And each thing that we do contributes together toward the change, and we don't know where it's going to go. And that's the problem, but also the possibility.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. Very helpful. Okay. Andrew, one thing that struck me in the written version of your paper, and it was sort of there in your oral presentation, was this phrase, the death of sovereignty. And I was wondering why you would want to defend the death of sovereignty as opposed to the transformation of sovereignty. So there's all kinds of negative things associated with sovereignty as you describe it, or autonomy as well, some negative things associated with sovereignty or autonomy. But I wonder if there aren't some positive things too. For example, in the context of the abortion debate, the locution, my body, seems quite appropriate. And I think we could imagine examples in the international realm too that involve the Ukraine. You know, that sovereignty and autonomy need to be rethought, but I'm just wondering about that phrase, the death of sovereignty or the death of autonomy. Secondly, in your paper you talk about how the separateness associated with traditional autonomy or traditional sovereignty leads to violence. And so the second option would be a chance for you to consider, or I would ask how you would respond to the observation that absorption in the whole can also be an incentive to violence. So right and left-wing totalitarianisms in the 20th century had what? An organic view of the state. And the first thing they tried to do was convince people that you should not think of yourself as autonomous individuals, but as, you know, part of Mother Russia or the fatherland or whatever. In other words, isn't violence really complex? And then maybe whatever you're going to say about the origins of violence is going to have to involve several considerations. And then thirdly, in your notes, I picked this one because I just wanted to show that I read these papers carefully, and I even read the dense notes. You denigrate social contract theory with the aid of Durkheim. And I was thinking of Charles Mills, who makes a distinction between historical versions of social contract theory and then normative or hypothetical versions of social contract theory, as you find in Rawls. And the former, Mills legitimately sees as problematic. But might there still be some life left in social contract theory as a normative hypothetical device to have us all think together what a just society would look like, either at the national or international levels? So let me stop there and have you pick one of those and chat about it for a minute or two.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just start with the third one. The issue with social contract theories is very simply that it starts with a default of an asocial order, which then decides to become social. Subjects enter into relationship, but the default is that they're actually independent. And so I do think that is our modern international governance system. That's why the word international, because we are first nations and then we interact. I think that's just, I think Whitehead describes something very different, which is not just a oneness, but it's this concrescence, it's this constant becoming, which everybody else here can speak to much more articulately than me. But I do think that that going back to your second question as well, that there's a violence in misunderstanding it to either direction. If you lose the particularity of a human being, of a human body, if you lose that precious particularity and just absorb it into a oneness, then that is violence. And if you create a system in which, or a framework in which you have sovereign subjects trying to lord power over objects, or making objects of other people, then you're also in the realm of violence. So I think my hope of this is that the Whiteheadian vision does offer something which is different than violence, which is creative. And I think that's literally the question that we have to sort through in a way that I haven't found an answer to yet. Is what agency looks like if it's not either of those extremes.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you, wonderful panel. We have time for one short question, and I see Matt first, so he gets the prize.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much to all of you. My question's for Stephanie about Bruno Latour, the late, great Bruno Latour. So on the one hand, he really wants to welcome in the non-human world into what we call our political negotiations and associations, and he's developed this idea of the parliament of things. I wonder what you think about that, its viability, potential pitfalls or issues with it. But on the other hand, Latour, in Facing Gaia and in I think it was an LA Review of Books article about visiting with James Lovelock. He mentions one of Lovelock's friends who got him in touch, the ecologist Stephen Harding, who teaches at Schumacher College and has written a book called Animate Earth, and he's kind of more of a panpsychist, animistic, New Age adjacent maybe. And Latour was very critical and was critical in many places about not wanting to think of Gaia as a goddess. And so he wants to welcome in the non-human world, but he's distancing himself from these sorts of earth spiritualities. He's friends with witches like Isabel Stenger, so he's clearly willing to be in dialogue. But what's your sense of this tension in his thought?
That's such an interesting question, and I haven't actually thought about it in those terms, so I don't think I'm going to be able to give a very satisfactory answer, but I'll try. Maybe a place to start is with what I remember as being the first question you asked, which is what utility or what might be the value of some of his work in sort of assembling Parliament of Things, or the alternative to the sort of alternative COP that he staged. And I think on the one hand, the value is limitless, if for no other reason than the force of the dramatization that was brought into play in the staging of this Parliament of Things, where you have representatives not only of nations, of human nations, but of all kinds of constituencies, right? So sort of non-human constituencies have a spot at the table, have a say in decision making. The images alone are, right, sort of priceless. I think at the same time, there are certain limitations to that approach. It still retains a certain kind of image of representation, which I think maybe does not adequately give us a sense of entanglement, still retains a sort of sense of separateness, and raises interesting questions about possibilities for communication across barriers of language. But I wouldn't, I'm not interested in criticizing it. I think it's a great source of inspiration and has enabled people to do all sorts of things. A project I'm involved in Copenhagen right now, we held an experiment, a sort of experimental workshop in more than human politics, and we found inspiration in the work that Latour has done. As to your question regarding this tension in Latour, again, I haven't really given it much thought. I know he has this, I think it was with Tim Lenton, a piece on Gaia and why Gaia is not, I can't remember the title, maybe why Gaia is not God or why Gaia is not one or something to this effect. So perhaps the tension you're pointing to is between bringing in more of the non-human, but not wanting to sort of fall into a happy organicism. And in that case, the first thing that comes to mind is Lynn Margulis, who calls, I don't know if I can say this in here. Okay, so I won't say. She calls Gaia one tough something. So to give a sense both of the power, but also that power is not always good or happy. And so maybe that's one way of talking about the tension in Latour. But I love the question, and I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Let's give them a hand, everybody.